Have you ever wondered what happens when an innocent question shatters years of carefully constructed lies? In 1848, in the heart of the American South, a young boy's simple observation would unravel secrets that had been buried for generations. This is the story of how truth, no matter how deeply hidden, always finds a way to surface. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical stories that will leave you speechless. The late afternoon sun filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the Whitmore estate's grand parlour, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany furniture. The year was 1848, and the plantation house stood as a monument to southern prosperity, its white columns gleaming against the backdrop of endless cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean under the Carolina sky. Margaret Whitmore sat rigidly in her favorite armchair, her pale blue dress spread carefully around her like a protective barrier. At 32, she was still considered beautiful by Charleston society standards, her auburn hair perfectly arranged in the latest fashion, her posture impeccable, despite the corset that restricted her breathing, her hands folded delicately in her lap in the manner that had been drilled into her since childhood. But beneath her composed exterior, a storm had been brewing for years, fed by secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. The parlour itself was a testament to the Whitmore family's wealth and status. Imported French wallpaper adorned the walls, depicting pastoral scenes that seemed to mock the reality of plantation life outside these windows. A Persian rug, worth more than most families earned in a year, covered the polished hardwood floors. Crystal decanters filled with expensive brandy sat on a side table, catching the afternoon light and throwing rainbow patterns across the room. Every piece of furniture, every ornament, every carefully placed book spoke of refinement, education, and the kind of old money that commanded respect throughout the South. "Mother, may I have some tea?" asked 8-year-old Thomas, her son, as he played with his wooden soldiers on the Persian rug. His blonde hair caught the afternoon light like spun gold, and his bright blue eyes, so much like his father's, sparkled with the innocence that only childhood could preserve. He had arranged his toy soldiers in elaborate battle formations, complete with cavalry charges and artillery positions, mimicking the war stories his father told him each evening. "Of course, darling," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of Charleston's elite, each word carefully modulated in the way that distinguished the truly well-bred from those who merely aspired to gentility. "Sarah, please bring Master Thomas some tea." From the corner of the room, Sarah, the head house servant, nodded silently. At 45, she had served the Whitmore family for over 2 decades, her dark skin weathered by years of labor, her eyes holding secrets that could destroy the very foundation of the household she maintained so meticulously. She wore the crisp white apron and dark dress that marked her position as head of the house staff, a role that came with both privilege and burden. Sarah had witnessed the birth of every Whitmore child, had nursed them through illnesses, had kept their secrets, and protected their reputation with a loyalty that went beyond mere duty. The afternoon heat pressed against the windows despite the approaching autumn, and the air inside the parlour carried the mingled scents of beeswax polish, lavender sachets, and the faint aroma of magnolia blossoms from the gardens outside. A grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing moments with steady precision, its pendulum swinging in rhythm with Margaret's increasingly anxious heartbeat. As Sarah moved toward the kitchen, the heavy oak door creaked open, and young Samuel entered carrying a silver tray of freshly baked biscuits. The boy, no more than 8 years old, moved with the careful precision that had been drilled into him since he could walk. His bare feet made no sound on the polished floors, and his eyes remained respectfully downcast, as he had been taught. But his skin was lighter than most of the other enslaved children on the plantation, a café au lait complexion that spoke of mixed heritage, and his features, The shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, even the way he held his head, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the family he served. Samuel wore the simple cotton shirt and trousers that marked him as house staff rather than field worker. Garments that were clean but patched in several places. His hair, though kept short as required, showed the same natural wave as Thomas's. And his hands, though calloused from work, were long-fingered and elegant like those of the Whitmore men. Thomas looked up from his toy soldiers as Samuel approached, and for the first time in his young life, he truly saw the boy who had been serving his family for as long as he could remember. The wooden soldier slipped from his small fingers as his eyes moved from Samuel's face to his own reflection in the ornate mirror that hung above the fireplace, its gilded frame catching the afternoon light. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sounds of plantation life filtering through the windows. The lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, the faint voices of field workers ending their day's labor. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat as she watched her son's expression change from casual curiosity to something far more dangerous: recognition. "Mother," Thomas said slowly, his voice carrying a note of confusion that made Margaret's heart race. "Why does the slave look like me?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, filling every corner of the elegant room with its implications. The crystal decanters seemed to tremble on their table, the imported wallpaper appeared to close in around them, and even the grandfather clock seemed to pause in its steady rhythm. Samuel froze mid-step, the silver tray trembling slightly in his hands, his carefully trained composure cracking for just a moment. Sarah stopped in the doorway, her weathered face carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed the weight of the moment she had long dreaded. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at her son, then at Samuel, then back at Thomas. The resemblance that she had spent years trying to ignore, to rationalize away, to bury beneath layers of social convention and willful blindness, was now laid bare by the innocent observation of a child. Her hands began to tremble in her lap, and she gripped them together more tightly, her knuckles turning white with the effort. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you mustn't say such things." But Thomas, with the persistence that only children possess when they sense something important is being hidden from them, continued to stare between Samuel and his own reflection. The afternoon light seemed to highlight every similarity, the identical shade of blue in their eyes, the same stubborn cowlick in their hair, the matching dimple that appeared when they were concentrating. "But mother, look at his eyes. They're the same color as mine, and his nose. It's just like father's nose. And see how he holds his head when he's thinking. I do that too." The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, each note echoing through the room like a death knell. Margaret's carefully constructed world, built on silence, propriety, and the unspoken agreements that held Southern society together, began to crack like ice under the weight of spring. She could feel the foundations of everything she had worked to maintain shifting beneath her feet. Samuel remained frozen, his young mind unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. He had been taught never to look directly at the White family, never to speak unless spoken to, never to question his place in the world. But now, as Thomas's words echoed in his ears, something stirred within him, a recognition that went beyond the physical resemblances that had just been voiced. For the first time in his life, he dared to look up, to meet Thomas's gaze directly, and in that moment he saw not just similarity, but kinship. Sarah stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate, years of experience guiding her through this treacherous moment. "Miss Margaret," Umbushi said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of shared secrets, "perhaps Master Thomas would like to take his tea in the garden today. The weather is so pleasant, and the roses are blooming beautifully." But Thomas was not to be distracted. His 8-year-old mind, unburdened by the complex social structures that governed adult behavior, continued to process what he was seeing with the clarity that only innocence could provide. He stood up from his position on the rug, his toy soldiers forgotten, and walked closer to Samuel, studying his face with the intense curiosity of childhood. "Samuel," Thomas said, addressing the enslaved boy directly for the first time in his life, "how old are you?" The question was simple, but its implications were staggering. Samuel looked up, his eyes meeting Thomas's for just a moment before darting away in fear. In that brief contact, both boys felt something shift, a recognition that transcended the artificial barriers that had been constructed around them. I don't rightly know, Master Thomas," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. The truth was that enslaved children were rarely told their exact birth dates, their lives measured not in years, but in their capacity for work. "You don't know." Thomas's confusion deepened, his privileged upbringing having never exposed him to the reality that some children lived without the basic knowledge of when they were born. "But I'm 8 years old. Mother says I was born in the spring of 1840, on a Tuesday morning when the dogwood trees were blooming. When were you born?" Margaret rose from her chair so quickly that her teacup rattled against its saucer, the delicate porcelain singing a note of distress that seemed to echo her own internal turmoil. "Thomas, that's quite enough," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "Samuel, please take those biscuits to the kitchen immediately." But the damage was done. The question had been asked, and in that moment, the careful balance that had maintained the Whitmore household for 8 years began to shift irrevocably. The afternoon light seemed to grow more intense, illuminating not just the physical similarities between the two boys, but the vast gulf of privilege and oppression that separated them. As Samuel hurried from the room, his bare feet silent on the polished floor, Thomas turned to his mother with the relentless curiosity of childhood. "Mother, why won't you tell me why he looks like me? And why does Sarah look so frightened? And why don't enslaved children know when they were born?" Margaret sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she reached for her teacup. The porcelain felt cold against her fingers, and she realized that despite the warmth of the afternoon, she was shivering. The questions were multiplying, each one more dangerous than the last, and she could see in her son's earnest face that he would not be satisfied with evasions or half-truths. Outside, the sounds of the plantation continued, the distant voices of field workers heading home for the evening, the creak of wagon wheels carrying the day's cotton harvest, the gentle lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. But inside the parlor, time seemed suspended, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when years of carefully guarded secrets would finally be forced into the light. "Thomas," Margaret said finally, her voice barely steady, "some things are complicated. You're too young to understand the ways of the world, the reasons why things are as they are." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were inadequate. Thomas was not too young to see, not too young to notice, and certainly not too young to ask questions. And as she looked into her son's earnest blue eyes that were indeed the same shade as Samuel's, she realized that the moment she had dreaded for 8 years had finally arrived. The truth, like water finding its way through the smallest crack in a dam, would not be contained much longer. The afternoon shadows grew longer. The grandfather clock continued its relentless marking of time, and in the elegant parlor of the Whitmore estate, the foundations of a carefully constructed lie began to crumble under the weight of a child's innocent curiosity. The evening meal at the Whitmore estate was typically a formal affair, conducted with the precision and ceremony that befitted one of Charleston's most prominent families. The dining room with its crystal chandelier imported from France and hand-painted wallpaper depicting scenes of English countryside, served as a stage where the rituals of Southern aristocracy played out each night with theatrical precision. Colonel James Whitmore sat at the head of the mahogany table, his presence commanding even in the intimate setting of family dinner. At 45, he was a man accustomed to authority, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his shoulders, his steel-grey hair perfectly groomed despite the day's heat, his blue eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made him one of the most successful plantation owners in South Carolina. His uniform from the Mexican War hung in his study, a reminder of the discipline and hierarchy that had shaped his worldview. The colonel's hands, as he cut his meat with military precision, bore the calluses of a man who had worked his way up from modest beginnings. Unlike many plantation owners who inherited their wealth, James Whitmore had built his fortune through shrewd business dealings, careful investments, and an unwavering belief in the social order that had elevated him from the son of a small farmer to one of Charleston's elite. Margaret took her customary place at the opposite end of the table, her earlier composure carefully reconstructed but fragile as spun glass. She had spent the hours since Thomas's disturbing questions in her private chambers, trying to prepare herself for what she knew must come. Her lady's maid had helped her change into an evening dress of deep green silk, and her hair had been rearranged in an elaborate style that required nearly an hour to complete. But no amount of external preparation could calm the storm raging within her. The dining room itself reflected the family's status and aspirations. Silver candlesticks cast flickering light across the polished surface of the table, while portraits of Whitmore ancestors gazed down from the walls with expressions of stern approval. The china was Wedgwood, the crystal was Waterford, and the silver bore the family crest that James had commissioned when his wealth first allowed such pretensions. Every element of the room spoke of refinement, tradition, and the kind of established prosperity that commanded respect throughout Southern society. Thomas sat between his parents, unusually quiet for a boy his age. The afternoon's revelations had clearly affected him. Though he couldn't fully understand their significance, he picked at his roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, his mind obviously elsewhere, replaying the moment when he had looked at Samuel and seen not just a servant, but something more, something that the adults around him seemed desperate to deny. The meal proceeded in relative silence, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china and the occasional murmured request to pass the salt or pour more wine. Outside, the sounds of evening on the plantation drifted through the open windows, the distant singing of enslaved workers returning from the fields, the bark of hunting dogs, the gentle rustle of Spanish moss in the evening breeze. "You're particularly quiet tonight." "Son," Colonel Whitmore observed, cutting his meat with military precision. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command, but there was an undertone of genuine concern for his child. "Sarah tells me you spent the afternoon in the parlor rather than at your studies." Thomas looked up, his blue eyes, so like his father's, so like Samuel's, meeting the colonel's gaze. The weight of his afternoon discovery pressed upon him, and he struggled with how to voice the questions that had been building inside him all evening. "Father, may I ask you something?" "Of course, Thomas. What's on your mind?" The colonel set down his knife and fork, giving his son his full attention in the way that had always made Thomas feel important and valued. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the formal dining room. Both father and son turned to look at her, and she forced a smile that felt like a mask, her face muscles straining with the effort. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely steady. "Please continue." Thomas hesitated, glancing between his parents. The afternoon had planted seeds of curiosity that had grown throughout the day, nurtured by the strange reactions of the adults around him. Now, in the presence of both parents, he felt compelled to seek answers, even though some instinct warned him that the questions themselves were dangerous. "Father, do you know Samuel, the boy who brings our food?" Colonel Whitmore's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before he answered. Years of marriage had taught her to read the subtle signs of her husband's discomfort. "I know all the house servants, Thomas. Samuel is a good boy, well-trained and obedient. Why do you ask?" The colonel's voice remained steady, but Margaret could hear the caution beneath his words. He was a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of business and politics for decades, and he recognized the potential danger in his son's line of questioning. "He looks like us," Thomas said, with the directness that only children possess. "Like our family. Mother says I shouldn't notice such things, but I can't help it. His eyes are the same color as mine, and his face. It's shaped like yours, Father. Even the way he walks reminds me of how you walk." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and carefully guarded secrets. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her husband's face. Colonel Whitmore was a man who had faced Confederate artillery without flinching, but she could see the muscle in his jaw tighten as he processed his son's words. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its resonant tones seeming to count down the moments until the careful facade of their family life would finally crumble. Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for her husband's response, knowing that whatever he said next would change everything. "Thomas," the colonel said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "there are many people in this world who share similar features. It doesn't mean anything significant. Sometimes coincidences of appearance occur without any deeper meaning." But Thomas, emboldened by his father's calm response and driven by the relentless curiosity of childhood, pressed on. "But Father, it's not just similar. It's like looking at myself, but with darker skin. And Sarah acts strange whenever I mention it. She gets this look in her eyes like she's afraid. And when I asked Samuel how old he was, he didn't know. Why wouldn't he know his own age?" Margaret set down her fork entirely, no longer able to pretend to eat. The roasted chicken had turned to ash in her mouth, and the wine tasted bitter on her tongue. "Thomas, perhaps we should discuss this later." "No," Colonel Whitmore interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded soldiers and intimidated business rivals. "If my son has questions, he deserves answers." He turned his full attention to Thomas, and Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What exactly are you asking, son?" Thomas took a deep breath, gathering his courage. The dining room seemed to grow smaller around him, the portraits of his ancestors watching with stern disapproval as he prepared to voice the question that had been building inside him all day. "I'm asking if Samuel is my brother." The words fell into the dining room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Margaret gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat, while the crystal glasses on the table seemed to tremble in sympathy. Colonel Whitmore's face went completely still, his blue eyes fixed on his son with an intensity that would have intimidated grown men. The candles flickered in their silver holders, casting dancing shadows across the walls and making the portraits of dead Whitmores seem to move in judgment. Outside, the evening sounds of the plantation continued, the distant laughter of children, the bark of dogs, the gentle creaking of the great house settling into night, but inside the dining room, time seemed suspended. "Where did you get such an idea?" the colonel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "From looking," Thomas replied with devastating honesty, "from seeing, from wondering why no one will tell me the truth about something that seems so obvious, from asking myself why Samuel doesn't know his birthday, why he can't read, Why he has to sleep in the quarters when he looks so much like us." Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "James, perhaps—" "Margaret!" The single word from her husband silenced her immediately. Colonel Whitmore continued to stare at his son, and Margaret could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the consideration of consequences, the careful analysis that had made him successful in both war and business. The weight of the moment pressed down upon them all. In the kitchen, she knew, Samuel was probably helping to clean the dinner dishes, unaware that his very existence was being discussed in the formal dining room. Sarah was likely supervising the evening tasks, her weathered face betraying nothing of the anxiety that must be consuming her. Finally, the colonel leaned back in his chair, his decision made. "Thomas, you're asking about matters that are complex, adult matters that involve the way our society functions, the way our household operates, the way the world has been ordered for generations. But is he?" Thomas persisted, his young voice carrying a strength that surprised them all. "Is Samuel my brother?" The question hung between them like a sword. Margaret felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, years of carefully suppressed emotion rising to the surface. She looked at her husband, this man she had married for security and status, this man whose secrets she had helped keep for nearly a decade. Colonel Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of unspoken truths, of choices made in darkness, of consequences that had shaped lives in ways he had never fully acknowledged. "Samuel," he said slowly, each word carefully measured, "is the son of one of our house servants. His mother was. She was a woman named Lily who died when he was born." "But that doesn't answer my question," Thomas said, displaying a persistence that reminded Margaret painfully of his father. "Is he my brother?" Margaret watched her husband's face, seeing the moment when he made his decision. It was a look she had seen before, in business negotiations, in military planning, in the countless moments when James Whitmore chose pragmatism over sentiment, truth over comfortable lies. "Yes," he said simply, "Samuel is your half-brother." The night following Thomas's revelation passed restlessly for everyone in the Whitmore household. Margaret lay awake beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing and wondering if he was truly asleep or simply avoiding the conversation that loomed between them like a storm cloud. The moonlight streaming through their bedroom windows seemed to illuminate not just the familiar furniture, the mahogany armoire that had belonged to her grandmother, the delicate writing desk where she penned letters to Charleston society, but the shadows of secrets that could no longer be hidden. The bedroom itself was a sanctuary of feminine refinement, decorated in shades of rose and cream that spoke of Margaret's careful attention to propriety and style. Silk curtains framed the tall windows, and a Persian carpet covered the polished floors. But tonight, all the beauty and luxury felt hollow, unable to provide comfort against the weight of truth that had finally been spoken. Down in the servants' quarters, Sarah sat by the small window of her modest room, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she stared out at the plantation grounds. The quarters were a stark contrast to the main house, simple wooden structures with basic furnishings, housing the dozens of enslaved people who made the Whitmore prosperity possible. Sarah's room was slightly larger than most, a privilege of her position as head house servant, but it was still Spartan compared to the luxury she maintained for the White family. She had served this family for 23 years, had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. She had been present when Thomas was born, had helped deliver Samuel in secret, had watched both boys grow while maintaining the fiction that they were nothing more than master and slave. But she had never seen anything quite like what had unfolded in the parlor yesterday afternoon. In the small room he shared with two other house servants, Samuel lay on his thin mattress staring at the ceiling. The boy's world had been turned upside down by a single conversation, and his 8-year-old mind struggled to understand what it meant to be both a slave and a brother to the young master he had served his entire short life. The rough wooden walls of the quarters seemed to close in around him as he tried to process the implications of what he had learned. For the first time in his life, Samuel allowed himself to think about the questions he had never been permitted to ask. Why did he look different from the other enslaved children? Why did some of the older servants treat him with a mixture of deference and pity? Why had he always felt a strange pull toward the main house, a sense of belonging that he had been taught to suppress? The next morning dawned grey and overcast, as if the sky itself reflected the mood that had settled over the estate. Heavy clouds hung low over the cotton fields, and the air carried the promise of rain. Margaret dressed with particular care, choosing a deep blue dress that she hoped would give her strength for what she knew would be a difficult day. She had made a decision during the long, sleepless hours of the night, a decision that terrified her but felt inevitable. Her lady's maid, a young woman named Celia, helped her with the elaborate process of dressing that was required of a lady of her station. The corset was laced tightly, the multiple layers of petticoats arranged precisely, the hair styled in the latest fashion. But no amount of external preparation could calm the storm raging within her. Thomas appeared at the breakfast table with dark circles under his eyes, evidence that he too had spent the night wrestling with the implications of his father's admission. He picked at his eggs and ham, his usual morning appetite diminished by the weight of what he had learned. The breakfast room, normally filled with cheerful morning light, seemed subdued under the grey sky. Colonel Whitmore sat behind his newspaper, but Margaret could tell he wasn't really reading it. The pages remained unturned for long minutes, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set in the expression she recognized as his preparation for battle. "James," Margaret said quietly, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate care, "we need to talk." "About what?" he replied, not lowering his newspaper, though his voice carried a weariness that betrayed his sleepless night. "About what happens now, about Thomas, about Samuel, about the truth that's been spoken and can't be taken back, about the fact that our son now knows he has a brother living as a slave in our own house." Colonel Whitmore finally folded his paper and looked at his wife. In the morning light she could see the strain in his face, the weight of years of compartmentalized guilt that had suddenly been forced into the open. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the restless night, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "What would you have me do, Margaret?" The boy asked a direct question, and I gave him a direct answer. Nothing has changed in the fundamental structure of our household, our society, our way of life. "Everything has changed," Margaret replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Our son now knows he has a brother who lives as a slave in our own house. Do you think he's simply going to accept that? Do you think he's going to pretend he doesn't see Samuel every day and not think about what that means? Do you think he's going to continue playing with his toy soldiers while his brother serves him tea?" Thomas looked up from his barely touched breakfast, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mother's right, Father. I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I see Samuel, I think about how he's my brother, but he has to call me master. It doesn't feel right. It makes my stomach hurt." The simple honesty of childhood cut through years of rationalization like a blade. Colonel Whitmore's jaw tightened as he looked at his son, seeing in Thomas's face the moral clarity that he had lost somewhere along the way. "Thomas, you need to understand that the world is complicated. There are rules, structures that have existed long before you were born and will exist long after. But you made those rules," Thomas interrupted, his young voice rising with emotion. "You're the master of this plantation. You could change them if you wanted to. You could free Samuel. You could let him eat with us. You could teach him to read." The simple logic of childhood cut through years of rationalization like a blade. Margaret watched her husband struggle with the truth that his 8-year-old son had grasped immediately, that the system that enslaved his own child was one he actively maintained and could theoretically change. "It's not that simple," Colonel Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There are laws, social expectations, economic realities." "Why not?" Thomas demanded, his sense of justice rebelling against the complexity that adults use to justify injustice. "Why can't Samuel eat with us? Why can't he learn to read? Why can't he be free? If he's my brother, why does he have to be a slave?" Before Colonel Whitmore could answer, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying the urgency of her message. "Excuse me, Master Whitmore," she said quietly, "but there's a situation in the kitchen that requires your attention." Margaret could see the relief in her husband's face at the interruption, but also the recognition that this was merely a postponement, not a resolution. "What kind of situation?" he asked, rising from his chair. "It's Samuel, sir. He's asking questions about his mother, about his place here, about why he looks like Master Thomas. The other servants don't know how to answer him, and some of them are getting nervous. Word is starting to spread through the quarters." The weight of the moment settled over the dining room like a heavy blanket. Margaret realized that the revelation hadn't just affected Thomas. It had shattered Samuel's understanding of his world as well, and that disruption was rippling through the entire plantation community. "I'll handle it," Colonel Whitmore said, his military training asserting itself in the face of crisis. "No," Thomas said suddenly, standing as well, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "I want to talk to him. I want to talk to my brother." The word brother hung in the air, spoken with such natural acceptance that it made Margaret's heart ache. She watched her husband's face cycle through a range of emotions: anger, fear, resignation, and something that might have been pride in his son's moral clarity. "Thomas," Colonel Whitmore said carefully, "you don't understand the implications." "Then help me understand," Thomas replied, his persistence a mirror of his father's own determination. "But I'm not going to pretend Samuel isn't my brother just because it's inconvenient. I'm not going to pretend I don't see him every day and wonder why he has to live differently than I do." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame she had carried for 8 years. Looking at her son, this brave, honest boy who refused to accept the lies that adults told themselves, she made a decision that would change everything. "James," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them all, "let him talk to Samuel. Let them both understand what this means. Let them figure out how to be brothers in a world that says they can't be." Colonel Whitmore stared at his wife, seeing something in her face that he hadn't seen in years: determination, courage, and a refusal to continue living with the weight of unspoken truths. The woman he had married for her beauty and social connections had found a strength he hadn't known she possessed. "Margaret, you don't know what you're asking. If word of this spreads beyond our household, if other plantation owners learn that we're allowing such conversations, such questions, then we'll face those consequences," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I won't ask our son to live with lies the way we have. I won't ask him to look at his brother every day and pretend not to see the truth. I won't teach him to become the kind of person who can enslave his own family." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. Outside, the sounds of the plantation continued. the normal rhythms of a world that was about to be irrevocably changed by the courage of a child and the conscience of a mother who had finally found her voice. Thomas looked between his parents, sensing the magnitude of the moment, even if he couldn't fully understand it. "Please, Father, let me talk to Samuel. Let me try to understand. Let me try to be his brother." Colonel Whitmore closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, Margaret saw the man she had married, not the plantation owner, not the military officer, but the human being who had been buried beneath years of social expectations and moral compromises. "Very well," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of decision. "Sarah, please ask Samuel to join us in the parlor." As Sarah hurried away to fetch the boy, Margaret reached across the table and took her husband's hand. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily in months, and she felt him startle at the contact. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we face it together, all of us, as a family." The word family carried new weight now, encompassing not just the three of them, but the boy who was about to enter their parlor, the boy who had always been part of their family, even when they refused to acknowledge it. Samuel stood in the doorway of the parlor, his small frame silhouetted against the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. The grey clouds outside had begun to part, allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate the elegant room in a way that seemed almost ethereal. He had never been invited into this room as anything other than a servant, and the unfamiliarity of the situation showed in the way he held himself, uncertain, ready to flee at the first sign of displeasure, his bare feet shifting nervously on the polished hardwood floor. The parlor, which had always represented the height of white privilege and refinement to Samuel, now felt different somehow. The expensive furniture, the imported wallpaper, the crystal decanters, all of it seemed less intimidating when viewed through the lens of his new understanding. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to really look at the room, to notice the details that had always been forbidden to his gaze. "Come in, Samuel," Margaret said gently, her voice carrying a warmth that the boy had rarely heard directed toward him. The tone was so different from the usual crisp commands that he almost didn't recognize it as coming from the same woman. "Please, sit down." Samuel's eyes widened with confusion, his young mind struggling to process the invitation. Slaves didn't sit in the presence of their masters, especially not in the formal parlor. The very suggestion violated everything he had been taught since he could walk. He looked to Sarah, who had followed him into the room, seeking guidance from the woman who had been like a mother to him. Sarah's face was carefully composed, but Samuel could see the emotion in her eyes, a mixture of hope and fear that reflected his own confused feelings. She gave him a small nod, a gesture that somehow conveyed both permission and encouragement. "It's all right," Thomas said, rising from his own chair and walking over to Samuel. The movement was natural, unforced, as if the revelation of their brotherhood had simply removed an artificial barrier that had always existed between them. "You can sit here, next to me." The simple gesture, one child offering a seat to another, carried revolutionary implications in the context of 1848 South Carolina. Colonel Whitmore watched his son with a mixture of pride and apprehension, while Margaret felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The easy acceptance that Thomas showed, the natural way he reached out to his brother, highlighted the artificial nature of the barriers that adults had constructed. Samuel perched on the edge of the chair Thomas had indicated, his posture rigid with uncertainty. He had been taught from birth never to relax in the presence of white people, never to assume equality, never to forget his place. But Thomas's earnest blue eyes, eyes that mirrored his own, seemed to invite him to set aside those lessons, at least for this moment. The morning light continued to shift as clouds moved across the sky, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to dance across the room. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing moments with its steady rhythm, but time seemed suspended as the two boys looked at each other with new understanding. "Samuel," Thomas began, his 8-year-old voice carrying a gravity beyond his years, "yesterday I learned something important. I learned that you're my brother." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The word brother, spoken so openly, so matter-of-factly, shattered something inside him that he hadn't even known existed. It was a word he had never been allowed to think, much less hear applied to himself in relation to the White family. He looked quickly at Colonel Whitmore, expecting anger, punishment, denial. Instead, he saw something he had never seen before in the master's face: acknowledgement. "Is it true?" Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell and return him to his previous understanding of the world. Are we really brothers?" Colonel Whitmore leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time in Samuel's life, the man looked at him not as property, but as a person. The change in his expression was subtle but profound, a softening around the eyes, a relaxation of the rigid authority that usually characterized his interactions with enslaved people. "Yes, Samuel, you are my son, just as Thomas is my son." The admission hung in the air like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Samuel felt something fundamental shift inside him, not just understanding, but recognition. All the questions he had never been allowed to ask, all the similarities he had been taught to ignore, suddenly made sense. The way he sometimes caught glimpses of himself in the master's features, the strange looks from other servants, the feeling that he didn't quite fit into the world he had been born into, all of it crystallized into a new understanding of who he was. "But I don't understand," Samuel said, his young mind struggling with the contradictions that defined his existence. "If I'm your son, why am I a slave? Why do I live in the quarters while Thomas lives in the big house? Why can't I learn to read like he does? Why do I have to serve you instead of sitting at your table?" The questions that had tormented Thomas now poured from Samuel's lips with equal intensity, but with the added weight of lived experience. Margaret watched her husband's face as he confronted the fundamental injustice of his own actions, enslaving his own child, denying him education, love, recognition. "Because," Colonel Whitmore said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of years of rationalization, "your mother was enslaved, and according to the law, that makes you enslaved as well. The law says that children follow the condition of their mothers." "But that's not fair," Thomas interjected, his sense of justice rebelling against the explanation. "Laws can be changed. You could free him. You could acknowledge him as your son. You could treat him like family." Colonel Whitmore looked at his legitimate son, seeing in Thomas's face the moral clarity that he had lost somewhere along the way. The boy's innocence cut through decades of social conditioning and legal justification, exposing the arbitrary cruelty of the system they all lived within. "Thomas, you don't understand the implications. If I were to acknowledge Samuel publicly, if I were to free him and treat him as my son, it would destroy our family's reputation. We would be ostracized from society. Our business would suffer. Everything we've built would be at risk." "But what about what's right?" Thomas demanded, his young voice carrying a passion that surprised the adults in the room. "What about what's fair to Samuel? What about treating him like the brother he is?" The question cut to the heart of everything. Margaret watched her husband struggle with the choice between social acceptance and moral responsibility, between the comfort of conformity and the courage to do what was right. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, years of conditioning, battling against the undeniable truth of what his son was asking. Samuel listened to this exchange with growing amazement. Never in his 8 years of life had anyone discussed his welfare, his rights, his future as if they mattered. The realization that he had a brother who cared about his well-being, who saw the injustice of his situation, filled him with emotions he had no words for. The room fell silent as everyone grappled with the magnitude of what was being discussed. Outside, the storm clouds continued to gather, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the windows. The sound seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment, as if nature itself was responding to the upheaval taking place within the parlour. "Master Whitmore," Samuel said quietly, using the title he had been taught but investing it with new meaning. "I don't need you to acknowledge me publicly. I don't need society to accept me, but—" He paused, gathering courage he didn't know he possessed, his small hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Could I learn to read? Could I learn the same things Thomas learns? Could I understand the world the way he does?" The request was simple, but its implications were staggering. Education for enslaved people was illegal in South Carolina. Teaching Samuel to read would be a criminal act, one that could result in severe penalties for the entire family. The law was clear, and the punishments were harsh: fines, imprisonment, and social ostracism for anyone caught educating enslaved people. Margaret found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to, the words emerging from a place of conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, you can learn to read." Colonel Whitmore turned to stare at his wife in shock, seeing a determination in her face that he hadn't witnessed in years. "Margaret, you don't know what you're saying. The law is wrong," she interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them all. "I've spent 8 years watching this boy serve our family, knowing he was my husband's son, knowing he was my son's brother, and saying nothing. I've watched him grow up without education, without acknowledgement, without love, and I've told myself it was necessary, that it was just the way things were, but I can't do it anymore." She turned to look at Samuel, really look at him, perhaps for the first time since he had been born. In his face, she saw not just her husband's features, but intelligence, curiosity, and a hunger for knowledge that had been systematically denied. "You are part of this family, Samuel. You always have been, and family members don't deny each other the chance to learn, to grow, to become everything they can be." Thomas jumped up from his chair, his face bright with excitement, the natural enthusiasm of childhood breaking through the heavy atmosphere of the room. "Yes, we can study together. I can teach you what I know, and we can learn new things together. We can read books and do arithmetic and learn about history." The joy in Thomas's voice was infectious, and for a moment Samuel allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to sit beside his brother, to hold books in his hands, to unlock the mysteries of the written word that had always been forbidden to him. The possibility seemed almost too wonderful to be real, like a dream that might disappear if he examined it too closely. But reality intruded quickly. "Master Whitmore," Sarah said quietly from her position near the door, her voice heavy with the weight of experience, "if word of this gets out, if anyone discovers what you're planning, the penalties for teaching enslaved people to read are severe. Not just fines, but imprisonment and the social consequences." Colonel Whitmore nodded grimly, his military mind automatically calculating risks and consequences. "I know the risks, Sarah. We all do. The question is whether we're willing to accept them." So he looked around the room, at his wife, whose face showed a determination he hadn't seen in years, at his legitimate son, whose moral courage shamed him, at his enslaved son, whose very existence challenged everything he had been taught to believe, at Sarah, whose loyalty had protected his family's secrets for decades. "If we do this," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of command decision. It has to be completely secret. Samuel's education would have to take place away from the other servants, away from any visitors, away from anyone who might report it to the authorities. The risk to all of us would be enormous. "We can do it," Thomas said eagerly, his young mind already racing with possibilities. "We can use the old study upstairs, the one no one ever goes to. We can teach him everything: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography." Samuel looked between the faces around him, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. The possibility of education, of knowledge, of growing beyond the narrow confines that had defined his entire existence seemed almost too wonderful to be real. "But what about later?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. "What happens when I grow up? Will I always be a slave, even if I can read? What kind of life can I have?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Colonel Whitmore looked at this boy, his son, and realized that education would only make Samuel's bondage more unbearable. A man who could read, who could think, who understood his own worth, could not remain enslaved indefinitely. "I don't know," Colonel Whitmore admitted, his honesty surprising everyone in the room, including himself. "I don't know what the future holds for any of us. The world is changing, Samuel. There are people in the North who believe that slavery should be abolished entirely. There are debates in Congress, tensions between the states. I don't know what will happen in the years to come." He paused, looking at both his sons, one free, one enslaved, both equally his children. "But I do know that denying you education, denying you the chance to develop your mind is wrong. Whatever comes later, we'll face it when we must." Margaret reached out and took Samuel's hand, the first time she had ever touched him voluntarily. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of recognition, acceptance, and love that had been denied for 8 years. "You are our family, Samuel. Whatever happens, you are our family." The words carried the weight of a promise, a commitment that would change all their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As the morning rain began to fall more steadily against the windows, the Whitmore family, all of them, sat together in the parlor, united for the first time by truth, rather than divided by lies. Outside, the plantation continued its daily routine, unaware that in the big house a revolution had begun. It was a quiet revolution, fought not with weapons but with words, not with violence but with love, not with hatred but with the simple recognition that all children, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, deserved the chance to learn, to grow, and to be acknowledged as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. The choice had been made. The consequences would unfold in time. But in that moment, in that rain-washed parlor, the Whitmore family had chosen love over law, justice over convention, and truth over the comfortable lies that had sustained them for so long. Samuel squeezed Margaret's hand, feeling for the first time in his young life that he belonged somewhere, that he mattered to someone, that his future held possibilities beyond servitude. Thomas grinned at his brother, already planning the lessons they would share. Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for 8 years, and Colonel Whitmore, looking at his 2 sons, one legitimate, one enslaved, both equally his children, began to understand that some truths, once acknowledged, demanded not just recognition, but action. The rain continued to fall over the South Carolina plantation, washing the air clean and bringing the promise of new growth. For the Whitmore family, a new day had truly begun, 6 months later. The secret lessons in the upstairs study had transformed both boys in ways that extended far beyond academic learning. The old study, once dusty and forgotten, had become a sanctuary of knowledge and brotherhood. Thomas had discovered the joy of teaching, his patience and enthusiasm making him a natural educator, while Samuel had proven to be a remarkably quick student. his hunger for knowledge evident in every lesson. His progress was extraordinary. Within months he was reading simple books and writing in a clear, careful hand. But more importantly, their relationship as brothers had deepened, creating a bond that transcended the artificial barriers of race and status that surrounded them. They had developed their own language of glances and gestures, ways of communicating their brotherhood even in the presence of others who couldn't know their secret. The changes hadn't gone unnoticed. Other enslaved people on the plantation began to whisper about Samuel's new confidence, his improved vocabulary, the way he carried himself with a dignity that education brings. Some of the field workers spoke in hushed tones about the boy who walked differently now, who seemed to see the world with new eyes. Sarah worked tirelessly to protect the family's secret, but she knew that such transformations couldn't be hidden indefinitely. She had become the guardian of their clandestine education, keeping watch during lessons and deflecting questions from curious servants. The weight of the secret aged her, but she also felt a pride in what they were accomplishing. Margaret had found a new purpose in supporting her son's education, often joining their lessons and marveling at Samuel's quick mind and Thomas's patient teaching. The guilt that had plagued her for years had been replaced by a fierce protectiveness for both her children. She had begun to see Samuel not as her husband's shameful secret, but as her son in every way that mattered. Colonel Whitmore struggled daily with the implications of what they had set in motion. He had begun to see Samuel not as property, but as a son, and that recognition made the boy's continued enslavement increasingly unbearable. He found himself researching manumission laws, exploring possibilities for Samuel's eventual freedom, even as he knew the social and economic costs would be enormous. The question Thomas had asked that afternoon in the parlor, "Why does the slave look like me, Mom?" had done more than expose a family secret. It had forced a reckoning with the fundamental contradictions of their society, challenged the comfortable lies that allowed good people to participate in evil systems, and demonstrated the power of innocent truth to transform even the most entrenched injustices. As 1848 drew to a close, the Whitmore family faced an uncertain future. They had chosen love over law, family over convention, truth over comfortable lies. The consequences of that choice would unfold in the years to come, but they would face them together, as a family, complete and honest, for the first time. Sometimes, the most profound revolutions begin not with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but with a child's simple question that adults can no longer ignore. In the Whitmore household, that revolution had begun with 3 words: "Why does the slave look like me?" And in answering that question honestly, they had discovered that some truths, once spoken, have the power to change everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. History teaches us that courage often begins with the simple decision to acknowledge truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. What truths in our own time are we still afraid to face?